Hello, my name is Chelsea Trimble, and I'm a graduate nursing student at the University of Kansas Medical Center. I'll be discussing the prevalence of depression after concussion in today's presentation. Depression affects nearly half of all post-concussive persons within the first year after the initial injury, and about 2/3 of the population within 7 years. For comparison to the general population without a history of concussion, depression only affects about 1 in 10 individuals. There are a few factors that contribute to the higher prevalence in the post-concussive population compared to the general public. The first is the physical changes to the structure of the brain as a result of injury. Certain areas of the brain affect different mechanisms, such as emotions and mood. There could also be psychological effects from the incident itself that may cause depression. Lastly, some people are genetically more prone to develop depression as a result of inheritance. Part of the reason for the increase in prevalence after the first year is thought to be contributed to existential realization. With a mild injury such as concussion, people are acutely aware of any difference in themselves. Whether it is processing information or how they function, it is mild enough that one is aware that he or she may not be the same person that they once were. Initially, people may feel as though their injury may be temporary, but after the initial rehab phase has come and gone and the dust starts to settle, one becomes more aware that this could be a lasting effect. According to the World Health Organization, depression is the leading cause of ill health and disability worldwide, and it ails over 300 million people globally. It is a condition that affects one's mood, cognition, and physical well-being. Morbidity and mortality rates associated with depression are substantial. In adolescence, depression leads to trouble with schoolwork, obesity, substance abuse, and suicide. Due to barriers such as lack of mental health care and social stigmatization, depression often goes untreated or undertreated, although there are many treatment options available. Long-term depression can lead to the development of chronic conditions as well as impaired functioning, poor work performance, and stress on interpersonal relationships. The term concussion can be used interchangeably with mild traumatic brain injury. A concussion is considered a loss of consciousness, an alteration in consciousness, or memory loss related to head trauma. Annually, there are about 1.7 million traumatic brain injuries reported in the U.S., and of those, concussions or mild brain injuries make up 75 to 90% of them. Athletes endure a large portion of concussions, in particular football players of all levels. With that being said, soldiers are becoming a population of increasing interest in regards to sustaining brain injuries, and traumatic brain injury has been deemed the signature injury of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. All three of the articles used in this presentation were original research articles. Additionally, all three were cohort studies, with articles 1 and 3 being retrospective and article 2 being prospective. Concussion is the exposure of interest and depression is the outcome of interest. For the first article, which is of adolescence, both the exposure and the outcome were obtained through parental reporting, while both articles 2 and 3 use personal response surveys. Because article 2 is prospective, there was both an initial and a follow-up survey. This chart breaks down the measure of association for each article. To define, odds ratio, shown in this chart as OR, is the odds that an outcome, in this case depression, will occur as a result of an exposure, in this case concussion, compared to the odds that the outcome will occur in a non-exposed group, in this case no concussion. Relative risk, or risk ratio, shown as RR, is the probability that an outcome, in this case depression, will occur as a result of a given exposure, in this case concussion, compared to the probability that the outcome will occur in a non-exposed group, again, no concussion. I will now discuss the Henneken's criteria for each of the three articles. The first article was a 2014 article written by Chrisman et al. Potential biases for this study include recall bias due to the fact that data was obtained via parental interview, which relies on the parent being able to recall information pertinent to the child's injury and/or diagnosis, and for the parent to provide truthful information. Another potential bias is diagnostic bias, based on the fact that children with brain injuries are more likely to visit their physician more often than other children their age, and therefore there's more opportunity for providers to notice symptoms such as depression. Lastly, there is always a chance for selection bias when the researcher relies on a response to obtain data that the subjects will not respond in full, or will withdraw from the study before it is complete. Additionally, this study controlled the confounders' age, gender, parental mental health, and poverty. The second article is a 2012 article by Kerr et al. As with the first study, there is a potential for selection bias. In this study, a follow-up interview is required to complete the study. There is always a chance that the subjects either cannot or will not reply to the second interview, which could heavily impact the results. Again, there is a potential for recall bias, as data is dependent on the subject's ability to recall events that happened previously, and for the second interview, subjects are recalling information from more than 9 years prior. There's also a chance for misclassification bias because there is not a set method determined for the diagnosis of depression in this study. There could be an under or over diagnosis in this instance. This study considered over 25 confounders, but ultimately only controlled for years since retirement and a physical component survey. Also, this study had a strong dose response as it carefully addressed the increasing risk with multiple concussions. The third article is a 2012 article written by Wilk et al. As mentioned with the other two articles, this one also has the potential for selection bias and recall bias. Selection bias being based on the fact that the study relies on the assumption that subjects will respond to the survey and will do so truthfully, and recall bias being that the study is based off of soldiers' ability to recall happenings from their most recent deployment. Additionally, this study had many controlled confounding factors, including combat exposure, air evacuation, and blast exposure, among other things. As with Article 2, this article also addressed the relationship with an increased risk in multiple concussions. We will now review the strengths and weaknesses for each of the three articles. For Article 1, some strengths include that this study used a large population and carried out a nationally representative data set in order to avoid geographical bias. The researchers factored in several potential confounders such as socioeconomic status, parental mental health, age, and gender in an attempt to exclude other potential causes of the outcome at hand, depression. Weaknesses, the biggest weakness to this particular study is that it relies heavily on parental report. This could pose a problem for a couple of reasons. The first, most obvious, is memory, but additionally, parents may have concerns about their child being stigmatized for a depression diagnosis, among other things. Another weakness is that the researchers could not be certain that the subjects did not have depression symptoms prior to their injury. It is also possible that there is a larger population of youth with concussions than those that are actually getting diagnosed. This study only included subjects who were specifically diagnosed with a concussion. There is also limited data linking the timing of the injury to the development of depression. Likewise, there are potentially other confounding factors that could play a role that were not accounted for in this study. Strengths to Article 2 are that the researchers carried out a large longitudinal study. The study is a prospective cohort study, whereas many other studies regarding this topic are retrospective. Many confounding factors were considered, though years played in the NFL and a component of physical well-being proved to be the two that had the most significant effect on outcomes. Weaknesses include the fact that, due to the nature of self-reporting as the study uses, the effect estimates had wide confidence intervals. Recall bias as well as misclassification bias are two concerns as well. Misclassification comes from the multiple possible methods for diagnosing depression. There is no weight for severity of depression nor the length of time from diagnosis, which are weaknesses. And lastly, because this study focuses solely on retired NFL players, it cannot be easily generalized to the general population or to populations of other athletes. Other sports such as soccer or even other levels of football, including collegiate and high school, will likely produce a different set of results, and it cannot be assumed that these results from this study would be comparable. Strengths for Article 3. This study accounted for many confounding factors, including an important one in PTSD, as it could have an effect on depression symptoms as well. It also took into account not only the number of concussions sustained during the last deployment, but broke down concussions into subcategories that consider the severity, such as loss of consciousness. The researchers used a method similar to what the VA and the Department of Defense use in their screenings when soldiers return home from deployment. Weaknesses, as with the other studies, this study relies on a self-report method. The population used in this study was limited to soldiers from infantry units, and a number of soldiers who were seeking medical attention on the specific recruitment dates did not have the opportunity for inclusion. Another red flag is that the study did not factor in concussions sustained during other deployments or anywhere other than the most recent deployment. However, had they known this, they could have strengthened the study by using time as a control. And as previously mentioned, there are always other confounding factors that could be controlled. I will now discuss the results of each of the 3 studies. The first study examined adolescents aged 12 to 17. The results were a 3.2-fold greater risk for depression diagnosis with a history of concussion compared to no history of concussion. After adjusting the analysis to control for confounding effects, the risk was a 3.3-fold greater risk. Article 1 also discussed the need for any clinician working with youth to be aware of this association to be better prepared to screen such patients for the development of depression. This study encompasses both genders and does not specify criteria for how the concussion was sustained. Also of note, parental mental health and living below the poverty line showed an increased risk for the development of depression, so adolescents that fall within certain demographics are at a greater risk, and careful attention should be paid to those that fall into this criteria. Study number 2 examines the 9-year risk of NFL players with a history of concussion and the development of depression. This study is prospective and required an original as well as a follow-up survey and accounted for the number of concussions sustained. For those players that had sustained greater than 10 concussions during their career, they had a 5.8 times greater risk for the development of depression compared to players with no history of concussions. Additionally, the fewer the concussions, the lower the relative risk, with 1 to 2 concussions producing a 2.3-fold increase, 3.3-fold for 3 to 4 concussions, and 4.1-fold for 5 to 9 concussions. Though many confounders were considered, only the number of years since retirement and the physical component summary had a significant effect on the outcome. 82.5 retirees with depression stated that depression had some degree of effect on their daily activities. The third study was done on U.S. soldiers. The results of this study showed that soldiers with multiple traumatic brain injuries with a loss of consciousness were 4.2 times more likely to develop depression than those without. In this population, there are many overlapping symptoms between depression and PTSD that make distinguishing between the two very difficult. However, the strength of association between depression and a variety of other symptoms that could be related to concussion, such as headaches and sleep disturbances, were much stronger for depression than for PTSD. Based on the literature from this presentation, there is evidence to support the claim that there is a causal association between concussion and the development of depression. Additionally, there is an increased risk for each additional concussion sustained, meaning that someone who has sustained 5 or 6 concussions has a greater risk than someone who has only had 1. This holds true for persons of any age, and it does not discriminate based on gender or race. Having a history of concussion does yield a greater risk for the development of depression. Future studies regarding this topic of interest should include further studies about the impact of concussion in the adolescent population, as most of the research regarding traumatic brain injury is limited to the adult population. Likewise, there is a lack of studies that pertain to the general public. Most studies are specialized into categories of athletes or military personnel, two populations that will likely take more blows to the head than the average person, and therefore generalizations cannot be made off of such studies. It would also be nice to have studies of the general population for comparison purposes. While there is extensive research out there that has proven that there is a link between concussions and depression, the pathophysiology is not well understood. There seems to be a linkage between a change in the structure of the brain and neuronal damage that may be the culprit. Postmortem exams of post-concussive brains could be beneficial to future research in this area, and it may help to determine a treatment. Currently, there are medications marketed for depression, but perhaps there are measurements that could be done after a concussion to prevent the development of depression or other such ailments that have been linked to traumatic brain injury. This holds particularly true for youth, as clinicians are more hesitant to diagnose and treat depression in younger people. Lastly, research in this field tends to be heavily retrospective. A focus on more prospective studies as well as randomized controlled trials would help to solidify some of the research that has already been done and would greatly contribute to this area of research. That concludes the presentation. Here are a list of my references, and thank you for tuning in.